Hi everyone. Well, today I'm going to present you um, what have I learned about this subject called assessment and testing in the classroom. Well, first of all, we're going to start with the analysis of the different tasks that we develop during this subject. We're going to start with the first one, which identify the formal and informal assessment. We could realize that there are common differences. For example, when we talk about formal assessment, we consider that it is more focused with testing and with external standardized condition and range of language. But when we talk about informal assessment, we are going to identify that it is focused on observation, where you are going to collect information about learners and in classroom condition. Also, Harris told us that it is important that we could infer with continuous assessment and systematic observations because it is going to help us to link with the informal um, and formal assessment. So the continuous assessment is going to help us to do it link formal and informal assessment. Well, the second topic that we analyzed was about summative and formative assessment. Well, you can identify that Scriven tells us that it considers assessment to assist learning. The formative, it is more focused, as its name said, forms of assessment. And it evaluates the effectiveness of learning at the time during the course. Well, summative, it is more focused on assess learning and pass judgment. It means that only there are two aspects, pass or fail. Well, in order to continue, we are going to analyze the chapter number 2, which it is more focused about formal assessment. In this part, we do presentation. Let me can identify that there are test type according to purpose, and well, the text type is before, during, and after. Before, we could consider aptitude text. During, and there are 4: placement, diagnostic, progress, and achievement test. After, proficiency test. Well, the language aptitude test is focused to design with the basis and summarize. Design is related with to predict who will be a successful language learner. Basis, there are factors determining on individual's ability, like rote memorization, phonetic coding, etc. And summarize, well, there are a large scale tests taking a long time, try to predict learning ability over a long time, a long period of time, and finally concerned with future language learning. Placement test is more focused about make decisions regarding the placement into appropriate groups. It's based on theory of language proficiency, and it tends to be administered and marked. Well, diagnostic test, it helps us to determine and provide different information. For example, determine the strength and weakness about the students' areas and provide detailed information about the content of the course. It helps us to apply it at the beginning of any course in order to know what are the levels of the students and try to organize better the course, and obviously based on the characteristics and needs that they need to improve. About progress tests, we are going to consider the feedback, roles, and tests. Feedback because it is focused on the effectiveness of student learning, which is going to guarantee through progress tests. And the roles, there are two: the teacher and learners, where they are going to decide on appropriate modification to the program. And test is it is a small range of language. Achievement test, we're going to identify that there is the distinction, content, test, purposes, examples. We could start with distinction. There is a progress test and achievement test. The content it derives from the syllables, and the test it is internal or external. There are two types. Well, the purposes could be promotion, course certification, entry qualification to a job, and some examples could be CAT, PET, FCE, CAE, or CPE. Another example could be a Cambridge University test like CAT. Well, proficiency test, Bachman tells us that it depends on the extent theory with the proficiency test. It is based on syllables of language study, proficiency test, and specific language testing ability. The testing technique it is expected to cover all the relevant language skills and as authentic way. An example could be IELTS test, which is used as an indication of language proficiency for access to British or any university. A Bachman framework for characteristic tests could be the roles. The two main roles are the first one is play in making educational decision, and the second, the text as indicators of ability. The feature, the decision to be made, the content analysis, scoring procedures, and testing methods. Finally, the decision, selection, placement, diagnosis, progress, and grading. Well, related with the phases, there are three. The first one, the second and third generation, but focus on the test. Well, the first generation was more focused about grammar and translation approach. For example, answer question, composition, translation, simple question. Those ones are the common tests that the first generation was only taking into account to apply them. There are two examiners and mark the same language and two separates. When we talk about second generation tests, the questions are normally measured as discrete point, consider aspects of language, but texts are very, very long, around 200 items, so you could imagine the time. This is objective and interrogative. The overuse can learning mechanics teaching of discrete language items. And finally, the third generation test, the testing of integrative language. It is more focused on formats like objective and subjective. It identifies the communicative language ability. It links the first one and the second in order to conclude with this generation. Build a communicative test, and the communication has the main role in this test. And an example could be authentic reading with some transfer of information. Another example could be writing a letter, but you are going to be contextualized in order to do more nature to achieve. Well, the third generation test could consider some advantages like authentic and contextualizes in a nature. A weakness could be in the task. The nature of tasks could be speaking and writing as integrative. The techniques listening and reading demand global comprehension. And finally, generation of testing, how it was tested, discrete item versus integrative formats, declining importance of conservative linguistic models, and developing interest in different competencies. Okay, and this is the references. Well, to continue with the presentation, we are going to identify the next aspects of this subject. To continue with the presentation, we identify different questions important to analyze about what are the main reasons to test, what are the type tests, how far it is possible to predict a student's success in language learning, what basic questions should teacher or tester ask himself or herself before setting a text, and what are the essential differences between a classroom test and external examination. So, when we want to analyze the main reasons about texting, we are going to identify that according to many authors, the main reasons for are depend on the purpose of of the test. Moreover, testing helps to improve information about the progress of a learner, the language level, the strength, the weakness, and so on. Also going to be the guide to improve the teaching practice to achieve language learning progress. Related with the types of tests, and there are 5: aptitude, placement, diagnostic, achievement, and proficiency. We have checked before, and how far is possible to predict students' success in language learning? Well, a little bit hard due to it depends on the factor of an individual's ability to acquire a second language. We could consider rote memorization, phonetic coding, and the recognition of grammatical analogies. What basic question? Well, some questions that we could consider are the individual's ability of the learner, the main factors such age, education level, language background, etc. Maybe the purpose to apply the test and what we are looking for applying the test. The essential difference between classroom test and external examination. Well, the classroom test considers the syllables, and the other one is more focused on examining the level of language that they learn, the domain and the skills. Well, we are going to reflect and think about the text performance, the differences between text performance of competence, language use or usage, direct or indirect testing, discriminatory or integrative texting, objectively of subjectively marked skills, background, or forward-looking. But it is going to be related with our practice. For example, with the first one, we consider that text performance or competence, the text performance, it is more focused on develop the activity, but the text performance or competence, as I have mentioned, Chomsky tells us that the speaker listener knowledge of language, so the text consider more the ideal knowledge in competence than in performance, because in performance it must focus on the skills. Language use or usage, well, could be used but in a communicative way. But if we are considered grammar, it is more focused on usage. Direct or indirect testing, well, when we talk about direct, is because the competence is elicited and performance, but the indirect is more focused on the production of language use. The other one, discrete point or integrative testing. Well, the discrete point is when we identify the test like a battery of many items. And the integrative test, it is more focused on developing the skills objectively or subjectively. Well, it is related with objective assessment, the items considered as right or wrong. There is not a criterion to assess them, but only mark and find the correct answers. The skills that could be tested are two kinds, receptive and productive. The receptive skills are reading and listening, and the productive is speaking and writing. Obviously, there is a process to test these ones. And we check in the last chapter. Finally, when we talk about reflection, there are 5 important questions. What are your plans to continue learning? Well, as I have mentioned, it is important to keep taking more courses in order to improve the way to test. And what assignments have you found interesting and rewarding? Well, there are many assignments. First of all, what are the organization of the test? What are the differences of them? And some tools that I consider are online, because as we know, there is a new hybrid model to consider. And how can I assess them? Reading and listening, it depends on the progress that I have checked. Could be based on a rubric, maybe in a formal test or assessment, etc. And finally, we read about self-assessment. It is important to promote this self-assessment because, as we know, it is important that the students be conscious about their learning and how to improve their needs, and they could find different strategies to achieve their language learning. And those ones were the most important aspect that I considered for this subject. And that's all. Thank you so much for your attention. And those ones are the references for this video. Take care and see you later.